The porcelain cup shattered against the marble floor of the café, and in the sudden silence that followed, Elena felt fingers close around her throat like a vice, squeezing the breath from her body as the entire room froze in horror, none of them knowing that the man now rising slowly from the corner booth, his chair scraping back with a sound like thunder, was about to remind everyone in that café exactly what happened to men who touched what belonged to him. If you believe in second chances, in love that fights for you when you can't fight for yourself, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, share this with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to the channel because this story is about to take you somewhere unforgettable. 3 months earlier, Elena Voss had been nothing more than a name on a marriage contract, a woman who signed her life away to save her father's failing business, her hand trembling as she wrote her signature next to a man she had never met, a man the whole city whispered about in hushed, fearful tones. Dominic Marchetti was not supposed to be kind. He was supposed to be exactly what everyone said, cold, ruthless, a shadow that moved through the underworld with a reputation soaked in blood. But on the night of their wedding, when Elena stood in a borrowed dress in an empty cathedral, expecting cruelty, expecting to be treated like property, Dominic had simply looked at her with something unreadable in his dark eyes and told her she didn't have to smile for him, that she didn't have to pretend, that whatever this arrangement was, he would never touch her without her wanting it. She had cried herself to sleep that night, not from fear, but from the strange, disorienting relief of being seen by a stranger more gently than she had ever been seen by the man she'd loved before him. That man was Marcus. Elena's ex-boyfriend of 4 years, the one who had promised her forever and then shattered that promise into 1,000 cutting words the moment she told him she was struggling financially, the moment she needed him most. He had called her worthless. He had called her a burden. He had walked out of her life the same week her father's business collapsed, as though her pain were contagious and he refused to catch it. Elena had buried that heartbreak so deep she thought she'd never have to look at it again. She had told herself she was healing, slowly, in the quiet corners of a marriage that had started as a business deal and was becoming something she didn't have language for yet. Because somewhere between the silent breakfasts and the late-night conversations in the mansion's dim library, between Dominic teaching her chess with unexpected patience and Elena learning to stop flinching when he reached for her hand, something had bloomed. It was slow and unspoken, the way trust grows in soil that has been salted by betrayal before. Dominic never pushed her. He simply stayed, showing up in the small ways that mattered, remembering that she took her tea with honey, standing outside her door during the nights she woke from nightmares she never explained, never asking her to explain them either. And one evening, in the golden hush of sunset spilling through the library windows, Elena had kissed him first, and he had gone still for a moment, as though almost afraid to believe it, before pulling her gently into an embrace that felt like coming home to a house she never knew she was building. 2 weeks before the café incident, Elena discovered she was pregnant. She sat on the bathroom floor for nearly an hour, staring at the little plastic stick, feeling terror and joy tangled together so tightly in her chest that she couldn't tell which one would win. She was terrified of how Dominic would react, terrified that this arrangement she had come to cherish would crack under the weight of an unplanned life growing inside her, terrified that maybe this was a fragile happiness that couldn't survive contact with something so real. But when she finally found the courage to tell him, standing in the doorway of his study with her arms wrapped around herself as though bracing for impact, Dominic had risen from his desk so fast his chair toppled backward, and crossed the room to hold her face in his hands with an expression of such raw, unguarded wonder that Elena felt something in her chest finally unclench after years of holding its breath. He pressed his forehead to hers and whispered that she had just given him the first thing in his entire life that felt untouched by the darkness he'd built his world from, and for the first time since her wedding day, Elena let herself believe that this could actually be real. She hadn't told him yet about running into Marcus. She hadn't wanted to worry him, hadn't wanted to drag the ghost of her old pain into the fragile new joy they were building together. So when Marcus texted asking to meet, claiming he wanted to apologize, claiming he'd changed, Elena agreed to a quiet coffee alone, believing she was strong enough now to close that door for good, not realizing that Dominic, ever protective, ever watchful since learning she was carrying his child, had quietly arranged for one of his men to keep an unobtrusive eye on her that afternoon, and had decided, almost on instinct, to swing by the café himself after a meeting nearby, wanting simply to surprise her with lunch. The apology Marcus offered curdled within minutes into something uglier. He'd seen the ring on her finger, heard the whispers about who she'd married, and something bitter and possessive twisted in him at the sight of her radiant, healthier, happier than she'd ever been under his neglect. He began needling her, asking if she really thought a criminal could love her, asking if she was foolish enough to have a child with a monster, and when Elena, shaking but resolute, told him to leave her alone, that she was done being spoken to like she was worthless, Marcus's control snapped entirely. He lunged across the table, knocking her cup to the floor, and grabbed her by the throat with a violence that stole her breath and flooded her vision with black spots, his voice a hiss of venom about how she belonged to no one but the man who'd broken her first. Dominic crossed that café floor in seconds that felt like hours to the horrified onlookers, his hand closing around Marcus's wrist with a grip that cracked bone before he peeled the man's fingers from Elena's throat one by one, each motion precise and terrifyingly controlled, the fury in his eyes colder and more absolute than anything the city's rumors had ever captured. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He simply held Marcus's gaze and told him, in a voice like a closing door, that the woman he had just touched was carrying his child, that she was his wife, his heart, the only soft thing left in a life built from stone, and that Marcus would spend every remaining day of his existence understanding just how close he had come to losing everything for daring to raise a hand against her. Security dragged Marcus out as he sputtered apologies that fell on ears already deaf to him, and the café fell into a hush broken only by Elena's ragged, tearful breathing as Dominic dropped to his knees before her chair, cupping her bruised throat with hands that shook now that the danger had passed, his composure cracking into something achingly human as he asked if she and the baby were all right, his forehead pressed to hers, his voice breaking on her name in a way the city's most feared man had never once let anyone witness. Elena wrapped her arms around him right there on the café floor, sobbing not from fear anymore but from the overwhelming, disbelieving relief of being chosen, being protected, being loved so fiercely by someone who once seemed incapable of softness. She realized in that moment that she had spent years mistaking cruelty for honesty and gentleness for weakness, and that the man everyone warned her to fear had become the safest place she'd ever known. Dominic lifted her into his arms without a word, carrying her out of that café past a crowd that watched in stunned silence, and in the car home he held her hand against his chest so she could feel his heart hammering with a devotion he'd never had to speak aloud because it lived in every protective, trembling breath he took beside her. If this story moved something in you, if you found yourself holding your breath during that café scene, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to believe that broken beginnings can still lead to beautiful endings. And before we close this chapter, I want you to comment one word below that describes how this story made you feel. I read every single one, and I promise your words matter to me. In the weeks that followed, Elena's bruises faded, but what remained was unshakable. A marriage that had started as paper and obligation had become something neither of them could imagine living without, a love forged not in grand declarations but in quiet loyalty, patient healing, and the fierce, unwavering protection of a man the world called a monster and Elena now simply called home. Their daughter was born the following spring, and as Dominic held her for the first time, tears slipping silently down a face the underworld had never seen soften, Elena watched the man who once terrified an entire city cradle their child with a tenderness that proved, once and for all, that even the deepest darkness can be undone by the courage to love and be loved in return.